everybody, Matt, for initiating and Plevan for sponsoring JCC, the department. Thank you for coming. We are going to be talking, this talk is called Israel and Israeli Democracy After October 7th. But to talk about Israeli democracy after October 7th, we have to talk about Israeli democracy before October 7th. And we really need to talk because as a political science kind of question, it seems like a little bit of an academic field, but I want you to not, think of this as something that is relevant way beyond the halls of academia. This is a question about Israel's identity as a state serving its citizens, member of the family of nations, and as part of the identity of the Jewish people. So I want to start the story in the middle of history in a way, going back all the way to 2023, which I consider the middle of history because we have, the history of the state, and then we have after October 7th. Things feels like they really changed. And I'm going to do this all in 40 minutes. Okay, so I want to briefly remind us where we were in 2023 and why democracy suddenly became center stage in Israel. Then I'll go back to the roots a little further back, going back to like the late 19th century, to propose why the crisis of 2023 has its roots in the earliest history of Zionism, pre-state years, early state years, because I submit that we can't really understand the root causes of what happened in 2023 unless we go back and look at the historical roots. And if we don't do that, we have the wrong diagnosis, and if we can't identify the problems, it will be harder to fix them. And then I'm going to situate the problem in the present, where we are since the beginning of the war, which is a very complex reality, but there is a future-oriented end to what I'm going to talk about today. So first of all, what happened in 2023 was really completely different from anything Israel had experienced. January 4th, so the very beginning of 2023, just days after a new government was established, the Justice Minister released a long list of plans designed to constrain the authority of the judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court, and particularly its ability to provide a check and balance on the other branches of government. And that really involved reducing judicial review and reducing judicial independence. And Israelis were shocked by this. They were so shocked that they began demonstrating right away. They view the Supreme Court as the main institution that puts any constraints on government, which is true. The court also has advanced liberal values over the years in Israel. Some would say, critics would say, the court has established liberal values of Israel, by contrast to legislating. And they saw it was under attack, so they immediately went out to the streets with like shockingly big demonstrations. And like any good Jews, the first thing they did was split, right? One portion of the demonstrators were demonstrating openly and firmly on behalf of the institutions, protecting the judiciary and protecting democracy. And another portion of the demonstrators were saying, we are for peace, we are for ending the occupation over the Palestinians. This is key to the struggle for democracy. But the first half said, well, that's a different issue. This isn't the time to talk about conflict and occupation. And so one of the first things that happened was that we had two separate demonstrations. But through their conversations, eventually, the first camp became the dominant and became a very, very broad tent of people demonstrating on behalf of democracy from many sort of political backgrounds, including people who had voted for the government doing it, who were surprised and unhappy with it. And the people who were supporting peace and an end to the occupation, they would participate in demonstrations, but they didn't take a leading role. And the organizers purposely didn't want them really talking about it at the speeches. The protests just got bigger and bigger. I won't go through every detail. I was going to talk about where we were exactly a year ago, almost yesterday, when the prime minister tried to fire the defense minister from his position only because the defense minister said, we need to pause this legislation. And the reason he said that was because Israelis were so terrified that it would pass that some reservists had threatened not to do army service. So the prime minister then fired the defense minister for calling for a pause, and huge crowds went out. They called a strike. The entire country was shut down. And people were saying remarkable things. They were saying March 27th is our second day, day of independence. They were chanting things like, unless we get equality, we'll block the central highway. It almost rhymes in English, but it rhymes better in Hebrew. They were saying, we won't stop demonstrating until there's a constitution. We had law scholars organizing to volunteer to give like parlor meetings, lessons in constitutional democracy. It was an extraordinary mobilization. the government was essentially forced to first break up the package of reforms, slow them down, and finally really couldn't pass nearly any of them until the summer when they passed one of the long list of pieces of legislation that would have constrained the judiciary. So I wanted to give that as background to ask the following question. Does all this mean that Israel is under dramatic attack on its democracy and that its democracy is on its last legs? Or is it an indication that democracy is vibrant because people went out, expressed their protest, mobilized, got engaged, and the government was forced to respond? I'm not going to answer that right now. I think ultimately the answer is both. But the fact is that the reason people went out, the reason why people were so shocked is because they realized that democracy in Israel is vulnerable. First and foremost, I think that was the conclusion that all of these people demonstrating realized that one policy package, one announced one day, suddenly made them feel like they had no foundation for their basic rights. And, the premise of my book is basically why was Israeli democracy so vulnerable? But I wasn't asking that question in 2023. I was asking that question in the summer of 2021, okay, roughly 2 years or a year and a half earlier. And I was asking that question because for years, I pin it at around 10 years, politicians, mostly of the leading parties, which is essentially right-wing parties who have been in government, other right-wing media, public figures have been attacking the judiciary in various ways, rhetorically criticizing it, writing very bitter op-eds, sarcastic, and also trying to advance plans over the years that looked pretty similar to what happened in 2023. All of the plans in 2023 had precedents in legislation or policies that governments had tried to pass and not quite managed. And so I was very worried about it for quite a while. I was wondering why and when the judiciary became an enemy of the people in Israel. And I realized that when you go back, you have to go back years and years to figure out the roots of the hostility, but it became a kind of stand-in for Israel's very ambiguous relationship with democracy itself. The court became like a symbol of all of the struggles that Israelis have with democracy, and it goes back. I kept going back. I thought, oh, I have to go back to the 1990s. No, I have to go back to the 1960s, and it just went further back all the way to the beginning of Zionism. So let's just go back there briefly. In the earliest years of Zionism, we're talking about the late 19th century, early 20th century, and I try to situate the analysis and the understanding of what democracy meant at that time. Right? The concept has evolved. We use it now in different ways than people used it then. And at that time, for the most part, when people said democracy, they meant elections, they maybe meant majority rule. And frankly, the early Zionists were nowhere near a majority. They weren't even close. They were tiny little clusters of people in a land inhabited by other people. And they were kind of wary to advance, to make democracy their signature kind of ideology if they thought about it at all, because they had different ideologies. I won't get into all of them, but Zionism, socialism, religious Zionism, a sort of nationalist, a nationalist kind of Zionism represented by Jabotinsky, which was actually more focused on liberal democracy. But again, we don't have to. But the point is, I think that as statehood became more of a reality over the first half of the 20th century, and certainly by the end of the Second World War, it became clear that democracy was the currency of the international community. And the Zionist leaders knew that they had to convince the world that they would be a democracy. But it had to be a little ambiguous. They weren't 100% committed because they didn't know if they would actually have a majority of Jews in order to make the democracy. And yet, when the partition plan was passed, right, UN General Assembly Resolution 181, it made the clear kind of obligation, included an obligation for a constitution for both of those states. Now, we all know the Arab states rejected it, as did the leadership of Palestinians at the time. What we don't always think about is that the Zionist leadership accepted it and then proceeded not to pass a constitution and to violate the borders. So in effect, they were not 100% committed to the issue of a constitution, partly because there was concern about some of the fundamental values. So when we talk about why there's no constitution, okay, we have to go through just a few points. Israel, first of all, was wary about enshrining the concept of equality of all citizens. That was one of the major reasons, not very often spoken openly, but it was clear partly because, well, I'll get into the situation of the Arab or Palestinian citizens, but largely because they were almost immediately put under military law. And, the country wasn't clear about who was supposed to be a citizen or not. And so therefore, not only did they not enshrine a constitution, but they did not define citizenship at all for the first 4 years of statehood, not until after Israel passed the law of return. So first they passed the law of return, allowing or trying to ensure that there would be a Jewish majority, and then later passed a citizenship law. Again, the Arab citizens or Palestinian citizens were placed under a military regime, which means they had no civil rights and they had no constitution to guarantee their rights, so they couldn't argue for them. The country didn't really want to define the relationship between religion and state, largely for political reasons. There were already ultra-Orthodox political parties. Ben-Gurion needed them in the constitution. As far as they were concerned, they had trouble enough accepting the idea of a secular state to begin with. They definitely didn't want a constitution because for them, the only constitution was Torah. And there's another reason I think we all have to admit, which is that David Ben-Gurion did not want limitations on his power. Some historians think this is the most important reason. He didn't want limitations on his power, on his party's power, on his government's power, and don't forget that Mapai, his government, controlled not only the government and most of the plurality of seats in the Knesset, but most of the quasi-governmental institutions, like the Major Labor Federation, like the Jewish Agency, a lot of overlap between his party and the army. And so there was a lot of control over society, no real restrictions. And what's interesting, I was thinking about this, what Likud is trying to do today, right? The attempt to weaken the judiciary in order to have very, very consolidated power for the executive power, which really has no limitations in Israel, is very much like the earliest years of statehood. Okay, so one of the overall conclusions that I come to is that we shouldn't be looking at the first decades as a romantic ideal that we want to go back to when Israel was more democratic. It was least democratic in the early years. Like I said, one party won nearly all elections, or won all elections for nearly 30 years. That was David Ben-Gurion's Mapai. Now, these elections were free and fair, right? Israel has always excelled in the electoral institution of democracy. But when you think about how much control they had over society, like, as I said, both, largely the Knesset, but certainly the executive and all these other institutions, just to give you the classic example that we often use, because his party controlled the Major Labor Federation. And the Major Labor Federation was the way to get healthcare. It had very much a captive audience. And so just multiply that by many other examples. Yes, they were free and fair elections and even universal suffrage, including for the Arabs who were under martial law, but it was not the most democratic environment. And let's see. Okay, so you had not only was there no such thing as civil rights for the Arab community because they were living under martial law. Again, there wasn't a constitutional basis to argue for them, but not having a constitution. And at that time, not having a tradition of an activist court, to rule on behalf of individual rights, meant that Jews didn't have a particularly strong basis for civil rights as well. And we had restrictions that we wouldn't stand for today in most democratic countries, certainly not in Israel. For example, restrictions on travel abroad. We had restrictions on labor rights, on right to strike, currency restrictions. Most media were affiliated with political parties. And again, non-activist court, no tradition of judicial activism, media who were essentially loyal to political parties, labor federation and other critical institutions controlled by a party, and no constitutional basis to have those critically important civic struggles to advance rights. So it was not the most democratic era. The second main conclusion, however, which I'm giving you before going through the analysis, is that democracy improves over time. Okay, so the first decades, let's say the first 3 decades, depending on how you want to count it, were the least democratic, but there are improvements over time. Examples, by 1966 through 1968, the martial law regime, which was based on colonial regulations, by the way, over the Arab citizens of Israel, that ends. Okay, it's a process of ending between late 1966 through 1968, but at least you have Israeli citizens being governed by the same law as their fellow citizens. And I would say that was probably the most visible policy openly violating democracy in the early years. So that's over. By 1977, you have the first peaceful transition of power to a completely different government, which at the time, I think many of the supporters of the ruling Mapai party said this is a threat to democracy because they were worried about what the Likud stood for. Right? But I see, you know, from a political science perspective, we see peaceful transition of power as a good thing for democracy. By the 1990s, I'm just going through each decade, in the 1990s, Israel finally passes two basic laws. Again, we don't have a constitution, but we have these evolving, incrementally adopted laws that are called basic laws. Most of them were just defining the governing institutions, but in the early 1990s, 1992, Israel, the Israeli Knesset, elected legislators, and I'm not saying that to you guys, I'm saying that to all those who accuse the court of having sparked the judicial revolution. These were elected legislators who passed the two basic laws defining very partial, but at least a basis for human rights in Israel. And that empowers the court to begin ruling, sometimes against legislation, sometimes against government policy that they think violate individual rights, and that helps them advance things like separation of religion and state. Very incrementally, Israel doesn't have much separation of religion and state, but there are some court battles against that status quo with very strong interference of religious aspects in public life that the court begins to push back. Gender equality, LGBT rights, press freedoms, and eventually the court also draws on basic laws and push back against specific legislation and begins striking down laws, which becomes very controversial. The third major observation, though, about this historical sweep is that even as there is progress for democracy and liberal democracy over time, every phase of that progress is matched by a parallel undemocratic process, okay, at the very same time. So I would like to give you a story of this neat arc, you know, rise, improving democracy, but it's always kind of being dragged down by undemocratic practices. So for example, the end of martial law over Arab citizens in Israel, I told you the years, right? Late 1966 through 1968. We all know what happened then, right? Israel, the Six-Day War was fought, Israel conquers the Palestinian territories and immediately establishes a regime that is based on the same British colonial laws that were implemented on the Arab citizens before, as well as newly developed martial law that Israel implements through the army, patchwork of Ottoman laws, Jordanian laws, basically something that nobody could figure out. I know we have a lot of lawyers in the room, trust me, you couldn't figure it out. This is not a democratic regime, right? It's not intended to be transparent. It's not intended for the citizens to be able to understand because they're not citizens. And that means that, you know, throughout all of the state, I won't go through every stage of the peace process, but spoiler, they all failed. So we don't have any peace, and as a result, Israel establishes itself more and more deeply and with greater geographical spread over time in the occupied territories, expanding into Palestinian areas in the West Bank, Gaza being ruled directly by Israel until the Oslo Accords, and then, you know, transferred to Palestinian Authority, but then 2005, but settlements were still there. 2005, the settlements are pulled out, but Israel retains effective control over the perimeters. But what you often see are the settlements, right? You see Israeli presence through the hilltops, and those are the things that make headlines. What we don't often see is the expansion of the Israeli state. Okay, as time goes on, although many of these processes started already in 1967, we're looking at a state from all branches of government. Okay, the executive, of course, the legislature is passing legislation that is added, you know, that it's too complicated to explain where it applies and where it doesn't. But legislation that allows laws to be carried over into the West Bank. The judiciary, of course, has been ruling on occupation-related cases since the beginning. So you have all of the branches of government, all of the arms of state are present in these occupied areas. So the project of occupation, which is like the parallel to the military regime over the Arab citizens, the most visibly undemocratic project, is continuing and expanding and deepening over all this time, even as liberal democratic practice and values are growing for Israeli citizens. But geographically, they're becoming more and more uniform, right, as settlements spread. Moving to the present, okay, over all of this time, the court, which, as I said, has become increasingly activist in terms of pushing back against both legislation and occasionally against the executive, also holding the government to be more accountable, right? Rejecting figures who are appointed but who have corruption in their past and have been challenged by citizens, for example. One of the few things the court, well, first of all, the court has has generated enormous resentment, specifically among the religious populations, for those small advances on separation of religion and state. These ultra-Orthodox communities are unhappy about that. They want more of the Jewish presence in Israel. And then there were, and a few other kinds of, even things like advancing gender equality and LGBT rights, that also upsets the religious communities because they're more conservative. But specifically when the court has occasionally ruled against specific cases related to the occupation settlements or occupation practices. For example, the placement of a particular settlement, the placement of the separation wall, the actual route of the separation wall. When the court has ruled against the use of torture in interrogations by the Israeli internal intelligence services, and rulings that helped advance little by little the need to draft the ultra-Orthodox, which is going on, continues to go on right now. All of these things make the ultra-Orthodox parties, the settler parties, or the parties that represent settlers, and eventually all the right-wing parties angry at the court. And then they start to develop, this perspective that says, you're not allowed to act to rule on a constitutional basis because we didn't mean the basic laws to be a constitution. Are they or aren't they? Nobody really knows. And they say you shouldn't be ruling on political issues because the legislature or the executive should be deciding those things. But what if the legislature or the executive won't do it? Won't make the actual policies clear. And so those groups have long-standing resentment against the judiciary. And then we get a prime minister who's under investigation for corruption. And I'm jumping ahead, I know chronologically I'm jumping up to recent years.
In fact, the investigation is in 25.
Yes, but I'm talking about the time when he was being investigated because that's the time that he personally joined the attacks on court. And he began giving speeches. And his first speech attacking the court was when the Attorney General announced that he would be indicted. It began before he was actually indicted. And then, of course, when his trial opened, he gave his great speech against the court, which basically turned into a deep state speech, saying, they're out there, they're trying to take me down, these political forces. It's, and we read this into his speeches, even if you can't find the words, because he said it in so many ways. It's the left, it's the media, it's the elites. They can't win in the ballot box, so they're trying to take me down through the courts. So then you have the perfect storm, okay? Throughout all of this, despite all of the progress that I had talked about for democracy, okay, that begins to put the judiciary in a vulnerable position. And yet, I should remind you that Israel's political system still has no clear constraints on the power of the executive. We have among the most unconstrained executives in the entire Western world compared to any other democracy. There's no real separation of the executive and the legislature. It's a parliamentary system. The government is drawn from the Knesset. There's no presidential veto over government activity. There's no federal system, so we don't have regions to balance the national government. We don't have any term limits, and we still don't have a constitution. We don't have any primary legislation even guaranteeing the equality of all citizens. We just don't have it. We have court rulings, but it's not primary legislation. We don't even have defined borders. So who's in, who's out, who's a citizen, who's not? We like that ambiguity. I mean, I like it, not as a political scientist and not as a citizen, but there is a vacuum because there's been so much pushing things down the road. And the current government in 2023 was trying to fill that vacuum. To its credit, it was one of really the only government I know of to openly say, we want an Israel that is more theocratic. We want an Israel that is less equal because Jews should have the privilege by law, by who we are. And we want to advance annexation. This was very central part of their coalition agreements. I mean, they don't use the term annexation, but it's very clear. The first line basically says exclusive Jewish self-determination in all parts of the country, including Judea and Samaria, etc. And if they need to do that by putting people in power who are either standing trial for corruption or who have been indicted or convicted of corruption, then they want the freedom to appoint those people anyway, which means they need to weaken the court because citizens will go to the court and protest those things. So that's basically the background in 2023. And now I want to go to the immediate present and future, and this will be the final part. So, by October, there was kind of a standoff. The government had managed to pass one piece of legislation, which was part of the original package to undermine the judiciary, only one. It generated huge protests, and immediately citizens, numerous groups of citizens sent petitions to the Supreme Court, and everybody was waiting for that. but it kind of looked like the government was about to lose because ultimately, and skipping to January, on January 1st, the Supreme Court ruled against that piece of legislation, and it was a basic law. So the idea that the Supreme Court would rule against a basic law, which has something like higher normative status, not actually defined, right? Still, that was a precedent. The court took a big risk in doing it, and the protesters who had been protesting for Israeli democracy all year felt like they were thrilled. You know, the standoff seemed to have been broken because the court ruled against the one piece of legislation. By that time, we were at war, and the government had expanded itself to include one of the major opposition parties. And so it was understood that the judicial reform is dead. The attack on democracy that they were trying to do, you know, it's all over now because Israel's at war. But let me tell you, war is not a good time for protecting democracy. The first thing that happened on October 7th was that the country declared a state of emergency, which I still haven't figured out legally, actually, because it's always been a state of emergency since 1948. But that just kind of reinforced that in a formal state of emergency, the government can pass legislation even without Knesset approval, or these processes are fast-tracked, and it gives the government much more far-reaching powers. So I would say the specific judicial overhaul plans are on hold, but a few examples of how the government has continued to try to consolidate its power. It has continued to try to place political loyalists into as appointments in numerous fields of government public service that should be either professional levels or independent government agencies, independent public agencies. For example, trying to put political loyalists into the board of the National Library of Israel, into the Higher Education Council, which supervises higher education policy. It has the Minister of National Security has intervened so much in the practices of the police and internal security that the top professional management levels have resigned. We're having mass resignations also from the police because of the sense of politicized practices. And I think there's a general tendency to try to, well, also the head of the authority for public companies resigned because of political interference. And there's a general attempt to make sure that the people who are in these positions are loyalists rather than professionals. The government has tried to advance legislation for stifling press freedoms. Right now, it's trying. This already began in 2023, but the communications minister is trying to advance a bill that would give him the power to shut down foreign media organizations that he deems to be a threat somehow. There is a possibility that the other minister who would sign such an order would be the Minister of National Security, Minister of Internal Security and Police, which is Itamar Ben-Gvir, a very extreme member of the government. And he's trying to draft, a tweak to the bill that would remove the authority of the Attorney General, the judicial figure, who's supposed to be signing off on that too. So it's all part of the same kind of process. The government quickly passed legislation undermining due process, worsening conditions of prisoners, extending the amount of time that people can be held without charge, et cetera. And they're now trying to legitimize the specific elements that would be part of an indictment against Hamas terrorist attackers who were caught on October 7th in order to charge them with crimes that can be punished by death. So I don't know if they're actually going to get there, but we're seeing renewed effort to legitimize the death penalty for that purpose. Okay, but I would argue that once you legitimize the death penalty, it's out there. And of course, continuing the project to advance annexation. Okay, minister who is our Minister of Finance also has a position in the Ministry of Defense, which gives him many of the powers that were once part of the army. And one of the things that he has done just a few days ago is to declare big portions in the West Bank to be state land. This is a bureaucratic technicality, very complicated to explain, but it basically means Israel will use that land as it wants, whether it's for settlements, whether it's for military zones, but there can be no Palestinian development in these areas. It's basically a form of bureaucratic annexation, the kind that's harder to see, right? Even if you don't see people on hilltops, taking them over. I would also add that this government is deepening Israel's isolation from U.S. policy and also from U.S. Jews, right? We know that U.S. Jews, I should say, the majority in all surveys still support Israel, right? If you just ask them if they support Israel, oppose it, or if they support Israel versus the Palestinians, surveys are still pretty clear about that, but we do know that among younger Jews, and it started a few years ago, there's much more skepticism about whether they can support Israel, whether they want to support Israel. And I think the war and Netanyahu in general, these policies, the war, of course, we know why, because there's a sense that Israel has become the bad guy in the war because it's so extreme. And in terms of Netanyahu's policies, I think that increasingly, especially in the US, American Jews can't relate to the political culture. They can't relate to the political system, except that they can relate to it because it reminds them of Trump. But they can't relate to it as a country that they feel close to. However, and on this I really will end, there are counter trends going on here. We, the people, have counter protested. So even after the war has started, there was, really remarkably in a way, within, I would say about a month, there were already demonstrations back on the streets. Okay, the demonstrations first and foremost were for freeing the hostages. We're trying to prioritize the hostages to make sure that they were the highest priority on the government's agenda. And the second form of protest that has become more prominent, thousands of people, not as big as the hostage support protests, but still big and consistent, are protests against the government. Now, these are not the same as 2023. Okay, they're not the same numbers, but the fact that there was such an unprecedented, extraordinary mobilization of 2023 has basically allowed the mobilization now. And certainly, let me just also not skip over the fact that on October 7th and in the following weeks, we had 200,000 Israelis who were displaced, 300,000 reservists who've been called up. None of the ministries were able to support them. Civil society was probably in its best, most organized position to help them because of the 2023 mobilization. The central groups leading the protests in 2023 immediately convert themselves into really impressive headquarters for mobilizing donations, distributing them, supporting the evacuees, and then they transform their activities into demonstrations for the hostages. And then you have, a subsection of the democracy protesters who have been mounting these protests very consistently over the last number of months. The other thing is, again, counter trends. Israeli polling has shown remarkably consistently since October 7th that the society is rallying around the flag for the war. Israeli Jewish society is very supportive of the war. Arab Palestinians are not, but citizens of Israel, much less so. You can like or not like the dynamic of Israeli Jews supporting the war, but at the very same time, it's a different kind of rally around the flag effect because support of the government has plunged. So in most countries, we see the rallying effect for the government, right? George W. Bush rating went through the roof during the Iraq War. What we see here is that the Likud party has lost about half of its, 40% to half to 50% of its support very consistently. I'm talking about more than 40 surveys that have been done on these issues. His pre-war coalition of 4 parties, actually 5 parties, has lost about a third of their votes very consistently. They only have a minority of the seats in parliament in polling, right? I know that's not the same as elections, but these are very consistent trends. And Netanyahu himself, for the first time that I can remember, really, is consistently polling it with a double-digit disadvantage behind the main competitor, who is Benny Gantz, which is remarkable because through all the years, including when he was indicted, including when he was actually standing trial, he maintained about 40 to 45% support among Israelis, and he towered above every other competitor. And now he's at 28% personal support, and he trails again. Benny Gantz is getting between 47 and 50%, and he's way below that. So Gantz, by the way, is considered by Israelis to be sort of right-leaning, center-right, pragmatic, but he's winning in all the surveys, and the opposition parties have a clear majority in all of those surveys. Now, this is all fraught. There's no clear answer to any of the questions I raised here, but I think most, more Israelis, maybe even most Israelis, I hope are coming to the conclusion that at least the time has come to start answering the questions, to start, really rethinking what went wrong with democracy in Israel historically, and start, questioning whether the time has come to commit themselves more fundamentally to democratic values than we ever have been willing to do before. And I think we can't afford to leave them for the future if Israel is to have a future. I'll stop there. Happy to take your questions.